romantic comedies of the 90s and 2000s and built a lifestyle empire that made her one of the most recognizable women in America. But almost nobody talks about what happened before all of that. Before the talk show, before the rom-coms, before the comeback, there was a little girl who was handed a glass of champagne at age 9 by her own mother, a child who was checked into a psychiatric facility at 13, a teenager who was legally declared an emancipated adult because there was nobody left to take care of her, a young woman whose entire childhood was consumed, exploited, and destroyed by the very industry that made her famous. Drugs, rehab, abandonment, a mother who saw her daughter as a paycheck, a father who was never really there, and a Hollywood system that smiled for the cameras while it chewed up a little girl and spat her out. This is the real story of Drew Barrymore, the life she survived when she had no business surviving it at all. Drew Blythe Barrymore was born on February 22, 1975, in Culver City, California, and from the very first moment she took a breath, the weight of a dynasty who was already pressing down on her tiny shoulders. The Barrymore name in Hollywood is not just famous, it is legendary. Drew's grandfather was John Barrymore, widely considered one of the greatest stage and screen actors in American history. His profile was so iconic that people literally called him the Great Profile. His children, Drew's father, John Drew Barrymore, and her aunt, Diana Barrymore, both attempted careers in acting with far less success and far more personal destruction. The Barrymore family tree was soaked in alcohol, mental illness, broken marriages, and unfulfilled potential. Generation after generation, the same patterns repeated themselves like a curse that nobody could break. Drew's father, John Drew Barrymore Jr., was a deeply troubled man. He was arrested multiple times. He battled addiction for most of his adult life. He was physically violent. He was emotionally absent. And when Drew's mother, Jade Barrymore, became pregnant with Drew, John was already disappearing from her life. By the time Drew was born, her father was essentially gone. He would show up occasionally throughout her childhood, briefly and without warning, before vanishing again. Drew has described these moments as some of the most confusing experiences of her life. She wanted so desperately to love him, but he made it almost impossible. That left Drew alone with her mother, Jade. And Jade Barrymore is one of the most complicated figures in Hollywood parenting history. Jade was a struggling actress herself. She was ambitious, social, and deeply enmeshed in the Hollywood nightlife scene of the late 1970s and early 1980s. She believed in the Barrymore name, she believed that Drew carried something special, and she was absolutely determined to cash in on it. Drew was 11 months old the first time she appeared in a dog food commercial. 11 months old. She was barely walking, barely talking, and she was already on set. By the time Drew was 2.5, she was auditioning regularly. By age 5, she had appeared in her first film, Altered States, in a small role. She was on a path her mother had chosen for her before she was old enough to form a single clear memory. But then something happened that changed everything, something that neither Jade nor anyone else could have predicted. In 1982, a small-budget science fiction film directed by Steven Spielberg was released. It told the story of a lonely boy who befriended an alien stranded on Earth. That film was E.T. the Extraterrestrial, and it became one of the highest-grossing films in cinema history. Drew Barrymore played Gertie, the little sister. She was 6 years old, and overnight she became one of the most famous children on the planet. The press loved her. Audiences adored her. She was funny and natural and completely uninhibited in front of the camera. She had this magnetic quality that even trained adult actors spend their entire careers trying to manufacture. In Drew, it was simply there, effortless, real. And that was the beginning of her destruction. Because when a 6-year-old girl suddenly becomes a cultural phenomenon, the adults around her are faced with a choice. They can protect her, shield her from the pressure, make sure she gets to be a child first and a celebrity second. Or they can exploit every single second of it. Jade chose exploitation, not necessarily out of malice, but out of ambition, naivety, and an inability to separate her daughter's success from her own desires. After E.T., the bookings flooded. Firestarter in 1984, Irreconcilable Differences in 1984, where Drew received her first Golden Globe nomination at 9 years old. Cat's Eye in 1985, she was everywhere. She was in demand. She was working constantly. But here is what was also happening during that same period. Jade was taking Drew to parties, industry parties, Hollywood parties, the kinds of parties where alcohol flowed freely and cocaine was passed around in bathrooms, the kinds of parties that a 9-year-old child had absolutely no business attending, let alone being used as a social prop. Drew has described these nights in detail in her autobiography and in countless interviews. Her mother would bring her along, dressed up, and Drew would sit in the corner of these parties watching adults drink, watching adults behave in ways that no child should witness, absorbing it all like a sponge, because children always absorb everything, even when nobody thinks they are paying attention. By age 9, Drew had her first drink, wine, at a party, with her mother nearby. By age 10, she was drinking regularly. By age 11, she was smoking marijuana. By age 12, she was using cocaine. 12 years old, barely in middle school, and already deep into a substance abuse spiral that most grown adults never recover from. And where was her mother through all of this? Present, nearby, enabling. Whether intentionally or not, Jade created the environment where this was not only possible, but almost inevitable. She was so focused on the career, on the parties, on the social scene, that she missed the fact that her daughter was drowning right in front of her eyes. The career began to stall. Directors started noticing that Drew was difficult on set. She was unpredictable. She was not the bright-eyed little girl from E.T. anymore. She was a troubled preteen with a substance problem and a home life that was completely chaotic. The roles slowed down. The phone stopped ringing as often, and without the work and the money, Jade's attention to Drew shifted in unpleasant ways. At 13 years old, Drew Barrymore was checked into the ASAP Family Treatment Center, a rehabilitation and psychiatric facility. 13. She was there for 18 months. Let that sink in for a moment. While most American kids her age were worrying about homework and what to wear to school dances, Drew Barrymore was in a psychiatric facility trying to detox from cocaine and alcohol because the adults in her life had allowed this to happen, had actively created the conditions for it to happen. While she was in treatment, something became terrifyingly clear. When Drew eventually got out, there was nowhere safe to go back to. Her father was gone, her mother had proven she could not provide a stable environment. Drew was essentially alone in the world at 13 years old with no real family structure and no one she could truly rely on. So she did something almost unimaginable for someone her age. She filed for legal emancipation from her parents. At 14 years old, Drew Barrymore went before a judge and was declared legally independent of both her mother and her father. She was granted the legal rights of an adult. She found her own apartment. She supported herself. 14 years old, living alone in Los Angeles in the 1980s. She has talked about this period as one of the most frightening and also one of the most liberating experiences of her life. Frightening because she was genuinely a child trying to navigate a world built for adults, liberating because for the first time she was free of the chaos of her family and she could start making her own decisions. But being legally independent at 14 does not mean you're emotionally equipped to handle everything that comes with it. Drew continued to struggle. The years between 14 and 19 were rocky, marked by relapses, bad relationships, financial instability, and the ongoing trauma of an industry that had taken so much from her while she was too young to protect herself. And still, the media piled on, because the tabloid press of the late 1980s and early 1990s was absolutely merciless when it came to former child stars. Drew was pictured stumbling out of clubs. Drew was written about as a cautionary tale. Drew was the punchline of late-night jokes. Drew was the example people pointed to when they wanted to talk about everything wrong with raising children in Hollywood. Nobody talked about the mother who brought her 9-year-old daughter to cocaine parties. Nobody pointed the finger at the father who abandoned her before she could walk. Nobody held the industry accountable for the way it consumes children and discards them when they stop being profitable. They just kept laughing at Drew. And then, just when it seemed like the narrative about Drew Barrymore was fully written, she did something nobody expected. She came back. Not slowly, not quietly, not with a small supporting role that people might charitably applaud. She roared back with a performance so commanding, so unexpected, and so layered with everything she had lived through that Hollywood had no choice but to pay attention. In 1992, Drew appeared in Poison Ivy, a dark psychological thriller where she played a seductive and deeply dangerous teenager. Critics took notice. This was not the little girl from E.T. This was a legitimate actress with genuine range and something real burning underneath the surface. Then came Gun Crazy in 1992, then Boys on the Side in 1995, then Batman Forever in 1995, then Scream in 1996, where she appeared in one of the most iconic opening sequences in horror film history. And then came the moment that fully rewrote her story. The Wedding Singer in 1998, starring opposite Adam Sandler, Drew played the warm, sweet, endlessly likable Julia. It was a romantic comedy. It was charming. It was everything that the tabloid press had insisted Drew Barrymore was incapable of being, and audiences loved it completely. Never Been Kissed in 1999, Charlie's Angels in 2000, where Drew also served as a producer, Riding in Cars with Boys in 2001, 50 First Dates in 2004, Music and Lyrics in 2007, Going the Distance in 2010. Film after film after film, a career resurrection so complete and so sustained that it stands as one of the most remarkable second acts in the history of Hollywood. But the personal life remained complicated for a long time. Drew was married 3 times. Her first marriage to Jeremy Thomas lasted just under 2 months in 1994. She was 19. Her second marriage to comedian Tom Green lasted a year before ending in divorce in 2001. Her third marriage to art consultant Will Kopelman produced 2 daughters, Olive and Frankie, before they too divorced in 2016. She has talked openly about her struggles with relationships, about how growing up without a father and with an unstable mother made it genuinely hard to understand what a healthy relationship was supposed to look like, about how she spent years choosing partners who were wrong for her because she had never had a model for what right actually looked like. And then there was the relationship with her mother. For years after the emancipation, Drew and Jade had an extremely fractured relationship. The resentment was real. The wounds were deep. Drew has been remarkably candid about the anger she carried toward her mother for bringing her into environments that no child should ever be in, for not protecting her, for treating her more like a meal ticket than a daughter. But Drew has also, in her own complicated way, found some form of understanding. Not absolution, not the pretense that what happened was acceptable, but an acknowledgement that her mother was also a damaged person who had grown up without the tools to do better. That kind of emotional complexity does not come easily. It requires years of therapy, self-reflection, and a genuine commitment to breaking generational cycles of dysfunction. And Drew, whatever her flaws, has clearly put in that work. The Drew Barrymore Show, which launched in 2020, became a genuine hit. Warm, funny, emotionally honest, and anchored by a host whose entire life story made her capable of connecting with virtually any guest on a human level. She has interviewed trauma survivors and celebrities and everyday people with the same generosity and openness, because she has lived enough to know that suffering is universal and that nobody should be made to feel alone in theirs. She became a mother, and by all accounts, becoming a mother changed her at a fundamental level. She has spoken about how her daughters gave her a clarity she had never experienced before, a clear sense of what she was willing to do and what she absolutely refused to pass down. She will not bring her daughters to industry parties. She will not make their childhood about her ambitions. She will not allow the machine that destroyed her to get anywhere near them. The cycle, at least in the Barrymore family, appears to finally be broken. Drew Barrymore is 49 years old as of this telling. She has outlasted the tabloids that mocked her. She has outlasted the predictions of everyone who was certain she would not make it to 30. She has built a career, a brand, and a family on her own terms from the ruins of a childhood that should have been someone's responsibility to protect. Her grandfather was called the Great Profile. Her father was called a tragedy. Her aunts were called cautionary tales. The Barrymore name was synonymous for generations with brilliant self-destruction. Drew changed that. She is not a cautionary tale. She is not a tragedy. She is not a ghost haunting the history of child stardom. She is a woman who survived, who rebuilt, who refused to let the worst chapters of her life define the entire book. And in a Hollywood that so rarely allows the children it consumes to write any kind of ending for themselves, That might be the most remarkable thing of all.